We've been talking today about big ticket items, budget debates, housing and monetary policy, economic growth. Next up, ideas that don't make headlines and perhaps should not be overlooked. For that conversation, please welcome Veronique De Rugy. She's a senior research fellow at George Mason University, and Sherle Schwenninger, director of the New America Foundation's Economic Growth and American Strategy programs. They'll sit down with my colleague, Derek Thompson.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you're having a good afternoon. The ambition of this panel is to surprise you just a little bit, appropriate level of surprise. The first question I wanted to just let you guys sort of hop on however you wanted is, what is an issue that you think, where you think its importance is just not reflected in either media coverage or in sort of talk coverage in conferences like this? And Veronique, we'll start with you.
They gave me a handheld because they hope I'm going to sing you a song at the end, and it will look better. Thanks for having me. I think that we talk a lot about redistribution, whether on the right or on the left. So the left, the redistribution from rich to poor is seen positively from the left and very negatively on the right, but I think it kind of obscures the real type of redistribution, a lot of what the government does, which is redistribution from the young to the old, from the consumers to the producers, from the not politically savvy to the politically savvy, so and yes, sometimes from the poor to the rich. So for instance, like on the poor to the rich, or young to the poor, young to the older, to seniors, we can talk about Social Security, which is a program which definitely has achieved its basic mission of providing basic protection to seniors. However, it's done it in a way that arguably is really doing massive redistribution from the young and relatively poor of society to the old and relatively wealthy in society, and it's good for seniors. Seniors' prospects have changed, and the wealth gap between them and younger is just really radically changed since Social Security was started. But I mean, it does mean that there's that kind of redistribution happening. Eugene Sterling at Urban has written a bunch of papers about the kind of redistribution from Black people and other minority towards white people through Social Security, seniors to single to married people, and we don't talk very much about this.
We mostly put it in the binary of, is this a progressive policy or is it a regressive policy?
Yeah.
But you're saying that we should think of other binaries. We should think of old versus young and producer versus consumer.
And I think it's there's other ways also we need to think about this. So for instance, like if you think about something I've been talking a lot about, export subsidies, right? I mean, Congress tends to think mostly about the producers and the impact of producers and the benefit to producers, and we tend to forget about the redistribution that these type of policy bring on from consumers to producers, and so on and so forth. And I think we really fail to acknowledge this.
Sherle, what about you?
Well, I think the most unspoken force or issue, as you put it, is something much more fundamental, and that there's a huge global imbalance between the supply of labor demand, labor, capital, productive capacity, and increasingly commodities, including energy now that we've seen the beginning slowdown of China, and the effective demand for those. And that, with the debt overhang, particularly the private debt overhang that Richard Vague spoke of this morning, is driving down interest rates, prices of goods, prices of commodities. And that's impacting us in many different ways. And because other countries are responding to this increasingly by reducing the value of their currency and engaging in extraordinary monetary policy, even more so than the U.S. did, we're now beginning to import deflation and downward pressure. Now, what's significant about this fundamental is it changes how you deal with a lot of different issues. And so our policy approaches, whether it's on the federal budget and government investment, whether it's on questions of Social Security, whether it's on questions of taxation and corporate income tax, is often wrong-headed because we're programmed to deal with a much different world. Now, where it is having the greatest impact and where we have to have the greatest concern about our long-term growth potential is that both a cause and effect of this imbalance is a huge decline in investment, both private and government investment in the advanced industrialized world, now increasingly in China, but in the US. And so we're in a major period of extraordinarily low investment, which will eventually correct the imbalance, but also will take away from our economic potential and growth in the future.
It was just interesting because, for a long time, particularly coming out of the recession, you heard a lot of talk from the Fed of, when is inflation going to happen? And the specter of inflation seemed to be haunting the economy, both here and I think abroad. But in fact, the story of the recovery is one of lowflation, one of incredibly low inflation, not just in the U.S., which has hurt wage growth, but also abroad. What would change it? There might not be one specific factor that you can turn, but what would begin to get inflation?
If the private sector is reluctant to invest for a variety of reasons, partly because there's not effective demand, then this is a classic case where you have to have government investment step up in a major way. But government investment is now, after we've run through the initial small increase in government investment that came with the Recovery Act, government investment, like private investment, and especially if you strip out oil and gas, which has driven capital expenditures, is at historic lows as a percentage of GDP. This is a very worrying development because therefore we're not correcting the problem. We're not crowding in private investment. But it also means that we're not, 10 to 15 years down the road, we're going to suffer from lower productive capacity and growth once we work through this imbalance.
Right. I wanted to talk about demographics, in particular about the millennial generation. Full disclosure, I am a millennial. I don't know how that affects the rest of this panel or your view of it. But when I think about millennials sort of politically, and then we'll get to the economics, it's interesting because on the one hand, there are a handful of issues on which they are clearly to the left of the rest of the country. And I think of them sort of heuristically as the 3 M's, gay marriage, marijuana, and immigration, which doesn't begin with an M, but it has a lot of M's in it. On all these issues, they are clearly to the left of Gen X and the boomers. Then you get to some political issues, gun control and abortion, where, interestingly enough, there's basically no revealed difference in preference between millennials and Gen X and boomers. But then you get to economics. And on economics, it seems to me, the opinion of the millennial generation is exquisitely sensitive to the framing of the surveyor's question. If you ask young people if they're interested in a government that provides lots of good services, they'll say that sounds like a wonderful idea. And if you ask them if they want a smart government that sort of tightens its belt, and you use nice euphemistic language like that, they'll say, well, that sounds like a lovely idea as well. So, Veronique, can you help us shine a little bit of light? Or maybe if you cannot shine light, talk us through your difficulty to find light in millennial economic views.
Yeah, I don't know if I can shine a light, but I can tell you what I find fascinating about millennials. It's like you are not like us, and probably like most of you, and you're an interesting bunch, and there are many of you. Like, what is it, 86 million, so there's like more than the boomer generation. And as you said, their views, I mean, it's an interesting bunch, right? Because, I mean, they're definitely very tolerant on social issues, I mean, at least on marriage and drug legalization, or at least decriminalization and immigration. And on economic issues, it depends on the way you frame the question. So one of the things I find fascinating about them is like fully 55% of them say they want to create a business one day. They're very favorable to profit because they understand that it is a reward to producers that provides the right services to their consumers, which I think is a good way to see it. They think that the government is inefficient. 2/3 of them think they're inefficient, and at the same time, they're not raging free market because free marketeers are libertarian because they also would like the government to provide more services. And as you say, it's contingent of how you ask, because if you ask them, well, do you want to pay for more services, they'll say no. And they're okay with they think we should reform Social Security and Medicare, but not in a way that hurts seniors. They're very favorable to reinvesting Social Security taxes, having private investment option. They're not favorable at all to growing defense spending. So they're an interesting bunch. And the
it
question
gets a little bit to your first point
Yes.
about transfers from old to young.
And the thing that's interesting is also what we don't know yet is how much of their view were shaped by the recession. Because if anything, they grew up, learning that Democrats and Republicans are alike in their ability to grow national debt, which they care about, and grow spending. And they've seen a lot of things go wrong with the war in Iraq and things like this. So they're an interesting bunch. The interesting question for me is who of the Democrats and the Republicans are going to actually grab this generation. And I know that they've overwhelmingly voted for Obama, but they've seriously soured in the last 6 years on Democrats. And it doesn't actually seem clear to me that Republicans and Democrats actually have offer platforms, certainly in this coming election, that actually will be appealing to them, because they're also ragingly independent. And so their vote is up for grabs. And I actually have a feeling when I look at the platform, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, with the exception of Rand Paul on some issues, that there's actually, I can't see that they're going to be that anyone's going to appeal to them.
Right. I should say, Sherle, before we go to you, that whenever we talk about the preference of a generation, it's very difficult to do so, responsibly. I know that you were thinking this too, but to do so responsibly, because when you're summing up the views of 86 million people, there's going to be a little bit of difference. But can you talk a little bit about some ways in which we know this generation is united, at least as it's involved in what we were talking about earlier, the sort of non-employee, productive economy?
Right, and what I have to say actually probably doesn't characterize their political views or any way, or even their economic and consumer views. What I think you can safely say is that this cohort, given the numbers and their age group, should be one of the economic drivers of the economy, but it isn't. 86 million is the largest cohort, and they're at the age where they should be becoming first-time home buyers, where they should be buying lots of durable goods, etc.
Just to add the statistic, most people consider this generation to begin around 1980 and end around 2000. Most generations are about 16 years, but let's just say those 20 years. And so that means that you're looking at a group of people that are between the age of 15 and 35. So
right.
Anyway, yeah. Keep going.
And the sort of middle to upper should be the beginning to have first-time home buyers, buying large, durable consumer goods, buying automobiles, etc. But partly because of the impact, the lasting trauma impact of the Great Recession, partly because of other cultural trends that you can maybe safely generalize. They're not either in an economic or financial position because of the job insecurity, the increasing cost of higher education, the lack of good entry jobs with sustained employment, that they're not in a position to drive the economy. And they're also being saddled with student debt and other debt. They're not in a position to take on that first mortgage. So the housing market has recovered to some degree, yet it's been hindered by the fact that the first-time home buyer, the young family who's not getting married quite as young or even postponing, is absent. And so what you have is a double demographic drag on the economy currently. You have millennials that don't have the economic opportunity or security to drive, and this would actually be the thing that would defeat deflation and bring back some inflation and purchasing power if the millennials were high spenders. But you have them struggling to be major consumers. And on the other hand, you have the impending baby boom generation retirement, which is leading to this perverse, that this is a late saving generation because they fell behind in their savings and they got hit by the financial crisis. But they're facing a situation where the financial conditions are not favorable to earning retirement income. They can speculate into stocks, but if you're approaching the age of 60, 65, et cetera, then the traditional investment advice is to switch into fixed income. But the loss of income from very low interest rates is actually quite significant. Moreover, many of the major the crisis is not in Social Security, which should be expanded, not shrunk, for a number of reasons, both for demand, but also because a lot of it was pre-funded in any case. The real crisis is in the private pension field that hasn't fully hit. And it's just not the headlines about particular state and local or big company. The problem is that life insurance and pension funds, which have long-term obligations that they used to be able to satisfy by matching up long-term instruments, including fixed income instruments, and which now are paying 2 to 3, 150, 200 basis points, where they've built into their models that they're supposed to be making 7 or 8% a year. So you're going to have huge shortfalls in a lot of private pension and life insurance companies. And you're going to have baby boomers that are scrambling to try to make up for lost savings and lost income. That's also a huge hit on the economy because they're supposed to be becoming consumers, not savers at this point.
Sure. Veronique, one more thing I just wanted to throw in there is I was thinking back to the earlier conversation that I was having on this couch about how some policies, it's difficult to assign some policies only one category of investment or insurance. I think it was Jason Furman who made the point that Obamacare, for example, on the one hand is an entitlement program, but on the other hand, because it allows young people to stay on their parents' health care until 27 and then buy their own insurance on the market even if they're not tied to an employer, there are some studies that suggest it is a benefit to entrepreneurship, which, as Veronique said, is a renewed interest among young people. And so it's difficult, therefore, to see how exactly a program like this cuts left and right. It's not just an entitlement program, it's also potentially an empower for people who want to be entrepreneurs. But you can either disagree with that statement or disagree with Sherle's statement.
I don't disagree about what you just said, but the thought that I had while you were talking is that actually I think this is where the surprise is going to come. It is because the economy is so slow. It is because the millennials have it so rough. Maybe not you have a great job, but they have it so rough in so many ways. And because they're thinking very differently, that I cannot imagine, this feeds the whole unfairness of the whole system that we have in place, and it is not sustainable. It's not, so we talk a lot about the unsustainability of these programs, but actually I think that it's not so much that will actually force reforms as much as it is the situation in which millennials are and the way they think extremely differently. And I don't think we have adjusted enough to the fact that change is coming. It won't be coming for the reason that, I've been harping about, programs are insolvent. I think it's going to come from the millennials demanding changes because their situation is untenable, and they're starting to realize it's a freaking unfair system.
One of the ironies of the millennial generations is that they're both the moving force but also the victims of a new corporate model. And this new corporate model is low capital investment, post-employment, meaning they don't employ many people. They don't pay very many taxes. And they impose productivity losses on their users. Now, this is Facebook and the whole range of new technology, third generation of technology companies. Now, the problem is that yes, these new companies and corporate models are very seductive, and there is something innovative about them. But they have also very low multiplier effects, so they don't employ actually very many of you. In fact, in the journalism field,
there's a lot of free work. There's a lot of people who are just happy to write online for nothing.
Right, for nothing.
Right.
When they
Their
used
blogs.
to pay Atlantic journalists
We
quite
have
hefty
less than 10
salaries.
minutes, and I want to touch the point of energy. When we were here, I believe last year, Sherle, we talked about the incredible promise from natural gas. And one thing that we've seen in the last few months, the last year, is some challenges because of the international market for gas. Where have your views updated?
Well, I mean, it's both the oil and gas and the non-conventional space. Well, we're now moving towards the bust phase, or
Bust?
in the bust. We were in the boom phase, which the oil and gas development accounted for a disproportionate amount of the capital investment and job creation, particularly good job creation. It also, by driving down energy costs relative to the rest of the world, aided in some reshoring of American manufacturing, etc. But what we have seen now is the overinvestment driven by a lot of easy money that went into oil and gas. But the structure of the U.S. into the world oil and gas market is very disadvantageous for the stability of the American oil and gas industry. The Saudis, which have increased oil rig count and production dramatically over the last 6 months, essentially are forcing the U.S. to become the swing producer. And so the U.S. industry is at an enormous disadvantage because the U.S. refineries are designed to disproportionately to use heavy, dirty, sour crude that is imported from Saudi Arabia, Canada, or Venezuela. The U.S. produces light, sweet crude that is relatively clean. The U.S. therefore when the U.S. therefore there's a built-in factor that we're always going to have some until we change our refinery policy. We're always going to have demand for global oil, but not domestic oil. Secondly, the U.S. can't export. U.S. producers can't export the crude. Refiners can export, obviously, refined products and some distillate. So it means that much of the burden of the adjustment of the oil from $100 a barrel to including natural gas, which fell much earlier because of overproduction, is going to be borne by American producers and the private debt, the banks that finance them. So we've created a situation with our cockeyed energy policy, or our oil and gas policy, where the great loss and burden will be borne by the American economy. And I think people in Washington sort of underestimate just how powerful the oil and gas industry was to economic growth and development over the last 5 or 6 years. In 2012, it accounted for 10% of the jobs created. That's why Texas had 33% of the net jobs created. And it contributed enormously to capital investment and the revival of American manufacturing. But now we're in the bust phase, partly exacerbated by bad American policy.
See if other industries can pick up the slack. We have a few minutes for questions. We've got one right here, and then the second one right here.
My name is Martin Apple. My hypothesis is the following. Short-term thinking drives major economic, political, and education, and those kinds of decisions when the nation craves long-term thinking as its future leadership. I think that's what's missing. Comment, critique.
I heard that the government is lacking in long-term thinking. Is that the upshot of? Okay. Everyone.
I mean, it depends on how you see it, right? I mean, I think, I don't know whether it's long-term thinking. One of the things I have a lot of faith in is all the innovators who are taking more and more chances. My colleague Adam Thier at Mercatus calls it permissionless innovation. And whether they're thinking long-term or short-term, I think we never know what the future is in store for us. But I have I'm an optimistic fundamentally at heart, and I'm more confident that this is what's going to bring, a lot of progress in the future. So I don't know. I mean, it's not exactly your question because I'm not quite sure whether investors think really long term. I think they have an idea, they think it can work, hopefully for the long term, and they do it. And I see a lot more people doing things and innovating it in ways that goes beyond the realm of what we've seen before. So.
All right, and the next question, which unfortunately will have to be our last question, or right here.
Hi, Shelley Porgas. I'm an entrepreneur in residence at Georgetown University, among other things I do. And I was excited to hear you ask about millennials and mention their quest to be self-empowered, really, by pursuing entrepreneurial ventures. I see at Georgetown that, that is, I think, for the future. Small businesses have created, 65% of our net new jobs. And when we're talking about driving the economy, which is what we've more or less been talking about all day, that's got to be a focus area. So when you think about that, what do you think is the single most important thing we can be doing to encourage young people not only to be thinking about what would that entrepreneurial venture be, but to actually empower them and enable them to do it? You're in the educational field with George Mason, I guess, among other things. So I'm curious from what you see from your point of view.
So I will say, I will say what is most important is to lift the barriers to innovate, lift the barriers to, I'll call it permissionless innovation, permissionless employment, get rid of occupational licensing, all the things that are a barrier to people, especially low-skill people, innovating and doing more things, entering new fields. I think that's what's important. I don't know whether you can encourage people by directing them in a given direction, but what I know is like if you actually open the field of what people are allowed to do, rather than actually restricting it with licensing laws or even by restricting what you can do and the kind of innovation you can get into, or by punishing innovators, like when you think of 23andMe, I think this is a future. A big part of the future of healthcare is going to be personal medicine, and you see a lot of intervention, whether by special interests or by the government, to try to actually put an end to this. I think it's the wrong way. If you actually leave that field as open as possible, you will encourage people to try new things. So permissionless innovation, go.
Sure, we'll pause for 2 seconds for that. We have about 40 seconds by my count. So.
Yeah, just let me add a note of caution, perhaps, that refers back to the first question. See, I do think that there's short-termism has crept into our innovation thinking as well. And so I find a lot of the innovation now is focused on very short-term payoffs of what is inconsequential innovation. And that as a society, both in the corporate world because of shareholder pressures, but in the government world, we're increasingly shortchanging the longer-term R&D and innovation that is really necessary to drive real gains. And so people are looking for the short-term little app that will make them, lots of money, but actually doesn't add anything at all to the economy because it merely duplicates in some ways what other people are trying to innovate and doesn't add to the overall productivity and growth of potential economy.
But
10 seconds.
Isn't it the case, though, that a lot of the great innovations of the last 20 years started in a garage rather than in a big corporation? And so in that, I think there's still a lot of hope. There's still a lot of garages in America. And this is the land of innovation.
The numeracy of garages in America be the last comment. But thank you very much.